A homestead run under modern liberalism would be a dysfunctional, unsustainable mess, mirroring the exact decay that liberal ideology brings upon nations. Instead of being a structured, disciplined unit where each member understands their role and contributes to the survival of the whole, it would be an environment of chaos, entitlement, and self indulgence. The same way a liberal society prioritizes feelings over reality, individual gratification over collective well being, and external validation over internal strength, this homestead would follow the same downward trajectory toward inevitable collapse. The father, if he even remains in the home at all, would be reduced to a passive background figure. His traditional role as a leader and protector would be dismantled in the name of equality and non authoritarian parenting. Any attempt to instill discipline or enforce rules would be met with accusations of being toxic, patriarchal, or controlling. He would become weak, constantly apologizing for exercising authority, and eventually he would disengage completely. His role would be more symbolic than functional. He might still provide for the family financially, but his influence over the household would be minimal. His children, lacking respect for hierarchy and discipline, would ignore him, and his wife would see him as an outdated relic rather than a partner in maintaining the homestead. The mother, instead of being the stabilizing force of the family, would be consumed by modern feminist narratives that convince her she is oppressed by the very structure designed to protect and empower her. Rather than raising her children with intention and wisdom, she would chase individual fulfillment, perhaps juggling a career, activism, or meaningless social engagements while outsourcing parenting to schools, screens, and institutions. The more she chases external validation, the more disconnected she becomes from the needs of her own household. She would encourage the children to express themselves with no guidance, leading to rebellion, confusion, and entitlement. Instead of instilling discipline and responsibility, she would prioritize emotional intelligence and gentle parenting, ensuring that her children grow up fragile, unprepared, and completely incapable of functioning in a harsh reality that doesn't cater to their feelings. The children, raised without clear expectations, would become the embodiment of liberal indoctrination, entitled, lazy, and convinced that the world owes them something. Instead of being trained in hard work, self sufficiency, and cooperation, they would be encouraged to follow their passions, regardless of how impractical or destructive those passions might be. The eldest child, instead of stepping into a leadership role, would reject responsibility, seeing it as an unfair burden rather than an honor. The younger children would grow up increasingly detached from the reality of survival, treating the homestead not as something to maintain and protect, but as a place to extract resources from without contributing anything meaningful. Just like in a liberal society, this homestead would prioritize outsiders over its own survival. While neglecting their own land, food production, and well being, the parents would teach the children that it is more important to be inclusive and progressive. Instead of focusing on the success of their own family, they would feel obligated to help others, even at their own expense. Resources would be given away recklessly, whether to strangers, charities, or government programs, rather than invested back into the homestead. The family would become dependent on external systems for food, security, and stability, mirroring how liberal nations strip themselves of sovereignty by relying on global supply chains, mass migration, and international institutions. Without strong leadership and discipline, the homestead would descend into dysfunction. Arguments would replace order, laziness would replace work ethic, and resentment would replace cooperation. The children, trained to value personal freedom over responsibility, would feel entitled to everything but contribute nothing. They would grow up soft, easily manipulated by external influences, and completely unprepared for real hardship. Just like in a liberal society, where people are conditioned to expect government handouts and social safety nets instead of building their own resilience, this homestead would produce weak, dependent individuals. Over time, the homestead would degrade. The land would go untended, structures would fall into disrepair, and basic survival skills would be lost. The family would have to rely more and more on external sources for food, shelter, and security, mirroring how liberal nations become increasingly dependent on foreign imports, corporate monopolies, and state intervention. Eventually, the homestead would collapse under its own mismanagement, just as every liberal society inevitably does. With no foundation of discipline, order, or responsibility, the entire system would rot from within until it was either consumed by external forces or simply fell into irrelevance. Liberalism, whether applied to a homestead or a nation, is a system of slow motion suicide. It destroys hierarchy, weakens structure, and prioritizes the comfort of the present over the survival of the future. It convinces people to dismantle the very institutions that protect them, leaving them vulnerable, dependent, and ultimately at the mercy of those who still understand the value of discipline and power.